this next session, you'll see Leanda de Lisle. If you enjoy the session, take a selfie and share your digital festival experience on our Facebook, Twitter or Instagram accounts to encourage your friends to join in too. So now, please give a virtual welcome to Leanda de Lisle.
It is the night of 21st November 1641. King Charles is less than 4 days' ride from London. He is returning from Scotland, where he has signed a peace treaty with Presbyterian-led rebels who had invaded his English kingdom. Now he must raise an army to crush another rebellion, this time a Catholic-led rebellion in Ireland. Sectarian massacres are taking place. Charles calls it a sea of blood. In Westminster, meanwhile, a Puritan MP called John Pym is putting the last touches on a parliamentary protest document known as a remonstrance. He is pulling together almost every complaint ever made against Charles's rule. This grand remonstrance paints a terrifying picture of a popish conspiracy to destroy liberty and the Protestant religion. The actors and promoters of this threat include the Church of England's own bishops, and the king himself cannot be trusted. Pym now intends to use his grand remonstrance to help drive through legislation that will reduce Charles to the status of a puppet king. But not everyone believes Pym can be trusted. Pym and his allies claim to stand for liberty and law against an authoritarian king, but they have promoted judicial murder and mob violence. Charles is now planning a state entry to London and is ready to fight back against those he judges demagogues and traitors who have been in league with the Scots rebels. How has it come to this? That is the question I want to answer today, while looking at the 50 pivotal days that saw a kingdom divided. So let us begin by looking into the mind of Charles I, a mind that was shaped by the times he lived in. In popular memory, Charles is recalled as a weak little man, clinging to grandiose theories of divine right kingship. But we should beware the echo chamber of our own prejudices, shaped by ancient patterns of thinking and the propaganda of the victors. The theory of divine right kingship was not designed to flatter royal vanity. It was a serious argument against religious justifications for violence, something we have experience of again today. Now we find it in radical Islam. Then it was a product of the post-Reformation divisions in Western Christendom. After the Reformation, both Catholics and Protestants began to argue that kings took their authority from the people, and so people had the right to kill any monarch of the wrong religion. This resistance theory allowed Protestants to justify the overthrow and death of Catholic rulers, like Charles's grandmother, Mary, Queen of Scots. It allowed Catholics to justify killing Protestant rulers, like the Dutch William the Silent, the first public figure to be assassinated with a gun. Fanatics could even justify killing rulers of their own religion if they weren't Catholic enough or Protestant enough. Here is Henri IV of France, killed by a fellow Catholic, angry at Henri's willingness to make war on the Catholic Habsburgs in alliance with Protestants. Charles's father, King James, came up with the counter-argument to resistance theory. James argued that kings drew their authority from God, not the people, that they therefore ruled by divine right. While a good king ruled by the laws and according to true religion, if they did not, only God could punish them. You couldn't just play God yourself. James had been King of Scotland for almost 35 years before he inherited the English throne from Elizabeth Tudor in 1603. In that time, he had faced threats from Catholic supporters of his deposed mother, but also from his own Protestant co-religionists, some of whom did not believe him to be Protestant enough. In 1600, James had faced what he believed was a kidnap attempt at the hands of two noble brothers from the Riven family. They opposed him imposing crown-appointed bishops on the Scottish Kirk's Calvinist councils, known as presbyteries. James believed that episcopacy, that is, church government by bishops, had a biblical basis. Presbyterians did not, and the brothers were acting in league with fiery Presbyterian preachers who James accused of wanting to lead the people by the nose and bear the sway of all rule. The Riven brothers were killed in the course of the kidnap attempt, and Charles was born on the very day that their rotting corpses were beheaded for treason in Edinburgh. Charles was 2 when James became King of England in 1603, and not yet 5 at the time of the Gunpowder Plot. This time, it was Catholics threatening his father's life and his own. One of the plotters suggested he was stabbed a little to prevent his servants taking him from London. This would almost certainly have killed him. He was a sickly child who suffered from weak legs and a lingual deformity that meant he struggled with a stutter. It is shocking how these disabilities are still used against him. We like to believe we have turned our back on old prejudices, but the way we remember Charles shows how they still influence the way we think. In the past, disabilities were seen as marks of sin. Think of Shakespeare's Richard III. His crooked spine is an outward sign of his crooked soul. Amazingly, we still use the same shorthand today. Think of the film Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman, the heroine, is a perfect physical specimen in her tiny, shiny shorts, where her opponent, Dr. Poison, the evil Dr. Poison, also a woman, is disfigured. It is common for Charles's fate to be read back into the physical difficulties of his childhood, as if weak legs were a physical manifestation of weakness of character, and a stutter symbolic of dumb stupidity. More interesting than the fact of Charles's childhood disabilities is that he worked hard to overcome them. After the death of his 18-year-old elder brother Henry in 1612, when he was 11, Charles trained himself through running and riding to become an extremely athletic adult. And he learned, with the help of singing lessons, to speak concisely but elegantly. If Charles had been the weakling of myth, you can be sure his enemies' propaganda would have made a great deal of it. They did not. And it is not very woke to suggest a mild stutter makes a man an idiot. So where did it all go wrong for Charles and his kingdoms? Charles inherited his throne in 1625, aged 24, and immediately married Henri IV's daughter, Henrietta Maria. The myth is that he was the only king of England ever to have been crowned in white. For his enemies, he was to become the White King of the prophecy of Merlin, a doomed tyrant. For his supporters, they were the white robes of a future martyr. So which king was he to be? Tyrant or martyr? Let's see. As soon as he became king, Charles had taken his kingdoms to war in Europe, fighting for Stuart dynastic interests and the Protestant cause against the Catholic Habsburgs. Protestantism was being pushed back in Europe, both by the energy of a newly reformed Catholic Church and by Habsburg armies, fighting in what would become known as the 30 Years' War. Britain feared being dominated by a Habsburg superstate. Charles's marriage to Henrietta Maria was intended to bring the support of French armies to help defeat the Habsburg enemy. The French didn't want a Habsburg-dominated continent any more than the English. But having a Catholic queen made some people in England nervous. The French had insisted, as part of the marriage treaty, that Charles stop persecuting Catholics in Britain. And Protestants feared this would allow Catholics, although a small minority, to become too powerful. In fact, Charles soon ignored the promises he had made the French. He heavily fined Catholics who refused to attend Protestant services and denied them any right to their own religious services. But there were other concerns about his policies, notably his reform of the Church of England. Charles shared his father's view that the Church of England was the best in the world, a halfway house between the pomp and superstition of Rome and the fantastic anarchy of Genevan Calvinism, where they had no bishops. James had written extensively, promoting the Church of England as a template for the reunion of Christendom. Charles preferred to use a theatre of ceremony and image. Parishioners witnessed a move away from a traditional Calvinist focus on sermons and impromptu prayers in plain buildings to set prayers and music in churches adorned with religious imagery in stained glass. Here we have a rather startling image of a nude Charles as Adam, who was of course made in God's image. It is a reminder that Charles is God's representative on earth. And elsewhere, in this chapel at Oxford, there is an image of Christ, also with Charles's face. Some English Protestants liked the new services, just as some prefer high church Anglican services today. But many hotter Protestants feared the changes threatened the Church of England's Calvinist traditions, while for those labelled Puritans, only Genevan-style Calvinism was real Protestantism. As the war in Europe was going badly, their fear of the triumph of a counter-Reformation superstate grew. MPs blamed Charles's leading minister and mentor, the Duke of Buckingham, for both the military failures and also the king's religious policies. To pressure Charles to sack him, MPs denied the king the taxes he needed to pay for his armies in Europe. But Charles, while intelligent and decent, was also stubborn, and he had poor political instincts. Charles saw their actions as unpatriotic, and he responded by extending his royal power in order to raise taxes under his prerogative powers, that is, his rights as king. This seemed to threaten the very existence of Parliament, because if he didn't need MPs to raise money in taxes, what did he need them for? The anger against Buckingham grew, with MPs like Pym accusing Buckingham of everything from murdering King James to plotting with the Pope. You see this in politics today. Extreme slanders heaped on political opponents, talk of treachery and betrayal. And we have seen murder follow. In 1628, Buckingham was stabbed to death by a disgruntled ex-soldier who had a copy of Parliament's latest complaints about Buckingham in his hat. Charles believed that Buckingham was a surrogate for himself, that he was the true target of the dagger that had killed his favourite, that the murder was an echo of past regicides, as well as a warning of further dangers to come. The following year, 1629, the breakdown in trust saw Charles dissolve Parliament and the beginning of 11 years of him ruling without one. Now, divine right kingship was not incompatible with having a Parliament. That is a common misunderstanding. Remember, divine right kingship said a good king should rule by the laws and according to true religion. Furthermore, kings of England had no standing armies. You could only rule by consent, whatever theory you held to on the origins of royal authority. Charles knew there were great benefits, therefore, to working with MPs, but he found people difficult to read, and he tended to lump all his opponents together as the forces of disorder. So he no-platformed his opponents, intending to rule without Parliament until he could be certain the forces of disorder had dissipated. It was a period later known by his enemies as the 11 Years' Tyranny, but it was also a time when the court was able to enjoy the fruits of the peace Charles was now obliged to make in Europe, as without Parliament he could not afford war. The poet Thomas Carew termed them the halcyon days, that is, days of idyllic peace, a time of glamour, masks and plays, and for the king, a time of growing domestic happiness. In 1630, Charles and Henrietta's son, the future Charles II, was born. As such, Henrietta Maria had fulfilled the principal duty of a queen consort, guaranteeing the political stability of a secure succession. Marital joy made Protestants anxious about her influence on the king, especially concerning religion. But although Henrietta Maria managed to convert a few court ladies to Catholicism, for Charles, the Protestant Church of England remained the best in the world. It is a myth that he ever leant towards Catholicism. Charles now began to repair royal finances through vastly expanded prerogative taxes. The most infamous was perhaps ship money. Now, in the past, traditionally, kings raised ship money on coastal areas in time of war, but Charles extended this so it was raised inland in time of peace, and it raised enormous amounts of money. He didn't spend this on trivial things like silks and satins. He invested in a royal navy, promising a future for Britain as a great naval power. These taxes were unpopular, as taxes usually are, but his right to raise them was backed by his judges. And his church reforms, while they faced continued opposition from Puritans and other hot Protestants, also had a growing following amongst the younger generation. Time seemed to be on Charles's side. He was still young, while many of his toughest opponents were aging men. Pym was already in his 50s, and the virile Charles now had a brood of children Henry VIII could only have envied. But then Charles overreached himself, determined to bring his three kingdoms into religious uniformity with the Church of England. In 1637, Charles introduced a new Church of England-style prayer book to Presbyterian Scotland. It was greeted in the Kirk of St Giles in Edinburgh by a planned and organised riot. Some later said Charles should have executed the ringleaders, like his father had beheaded the rotting corpses of the Riven brothers in 1600. If he had, they said, the riot would not have been followed, as it was, by a full-scale Scottish rebellion. Worse, his lack of ruthlessness encouraged his enemies in England. In 1640, a knot of England's opposition peers and Puritan allies like Pym plotted a treasonous alliance with Scots rebels that saw the Scots invade and occupy the north of England. After 11 years without a parliament, Charles was obliged to call one, as he needed huge amounts of money to pay the Scots to leave. It became known as the Long Parliament, because MPs passed laws that took away Charles's power to dissolve it. This perpetual parliament, as they called it at the time, was dominated by his enemies. Known as the Junto, this ruling group achieved power by using the principal weapon of populism, fear. They claimed that England faced a Roman Catholic takeover from which only they could save the people, warning that the king could not be trusted to keep Protestantism safe. They pointed to his Catholic wife, Henrietta Maria, and ancient prejudices about the seductive power of women made their claim that her influence was overpowerful the more believable. Think of Eve seducing Adam in the Garden of Eden. Behind Eve is the face of Satan, and Charles, of course, is Adam. They said his leading servants, even the Catholic-bashing former Lord Deputy of Ireland, Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, were in league with the Counter-Reformation. It was the kind of language they had used about Buckingham, and the Junto were more willing to spill blood than Charles ever was. There had been no political or religious executions during the 11 Years' Tyranny. But when Pym, as the prosecuting lawyer, failed to get Strafford convicted of treason at his trial, mobs were used to intimidate MPs to help push through an act of attainder against Strafford and to force the king to sign the death warrant. The term mob is actually invented in the 17th century to describe such scenes, taken from the Latin mobile vulgus. Strafford was beheaded on 12 May 1641 in an act of judicial murder not far short of a lynching. Increasingly, however, there was a sense amongst moderate MPs that the king had conceded enough to Parliament. He was by now obliged under the Triennial Act to call Parliament every 3 years. There could be no more 11 years' tyranny, while innovations in the Church of England that allowed un-Calvinist additions like religious imagery and organs were being rooted out. So, when Charles was in Scotland that summer, signing a humiliating peace with the junto's rebel allies, the junto continued to fan the flames of fear in England, executing Catholic priests in order to heighten the sense of threat. Charles had cropped the ears of dissident Puritans, which wasn't very nice. Priests were, however, being cropped of their testicles, their limbs, and their heads. Despite this fear-mongering, many moderates remained concerned about the junto. They saw a would-be oligarchy, and one that they felt was allied to religious and political extremists who threatened the social order, as well as the moderate Church of England of the Book of Common Prayer. Then, in October 1641, comes the junto's salvation. This is when Charles's third kingdom, Ireland, rises in rebellion. The Irish Catholics want Charles to give them religious freedom, just as he had granted it to the Scots Presbyterians under the terms of the peace treaty. But unlike Scotland, Ireland is a colony, and the rebellion provokes vicious sectarian killing between the Catholic natives and Protestant settlers. This sea of blood is a gift to the junto's propaganda. Now they have something to make the Catholic threat seem real. They use the fast-moving new media of pamphlets and news sheets to spread atrocity stories from Ireland and so ramp up Project Fear. So now we are where we were at the start, 21st November 1641. The king is on his journey from Edinburgh, returning to London. Ireland is in rebellion. Pym is in London working on the Grand Remonstrance. Pym and the junto now feel that they must strip Charles of any ability he might have in the future to revenge himself on them and to try them for the treason that they have committed by working in alliance with the Scots. In 50 days, Charles will lose his crown, or Pym will lose his head. The next day, 22nd November, the debate on the Grand Remonstrance opens in Parliament, and it meets with ferocious opposition. The Grand Remonstrance is essentially a grand conspiracy theory posing as a traditional protest document. Its purpose is to tell the people, yet again, that the king cannot be trusted, that only the junto can save them from the danger of a counter-Reformation takeover. It is, therefore, important to the junto that the Grand Remonstrance is not only passed by MPs as representing their genuine concerns, it must also be printed and published. Only that way can fear be spread beyond Parliament and its MPs to infect the whole kingdom. But in the debate, MPs point out that the king has already addressed most of the issues raised in the Grand Remonstrance. And many of them haven't forgotten that while the junto claims to stand for liberty and law, it encourages mob violence. But the Commons is largely empty, as London is recovering from a summer plague epidemic, and many moderates are still fearful of the mobs that were used that summer. The Grand Remonstrance passes by 11 votes at 2 a.m, when most of the few MPs who are in London are in bed. And even then, Pym fails to get agreement on its publication. Charles, meanwhile, is poised to remind London that he is their king and the father of his people, with a splendid state entry to London on 25th November. This is being stage managed partly by the Queen. The irony is that where in the past talk of her influence had been greatly exaggerated. Now that his closest ministers are executed or fled, and the junto has packed his Privy Council, the Queen has become by default an important unofficial advisor in matters of politics, although never religion. Now, we still hear a lot of old propaganda about Henrietta Maria, much of it very sexist. So it's worth bearing in mind that in France she was regarded as the princess most like her father, Henri le Grand, Henry the Great. Make no mistake, she is a formidable figure. The grand entry goes brilliantly. The church bells peal and fountains run with wine, while Charles is received everywhere with universal acclamations. He responds with gestures and speech, causing the crowds to erupt in a renewal of the shouts of welcome. At the Guildhall, the aldermen lay on a feast, and afterwards the King and Queen are escorted to the Royal Palace of Whitehall by torchlight, the crowds roaring their approval. God save the King! God save the King! Charles had never been one for playing to the crowds, but for once he was showing a populist touch. He is learning from his enemies. But will he learn fast enough? And will he match them for ruthlessness? The King's next move is to take control of the army needed for Ireland. With the peace signed in Edinburgh that summer, the English army has been disbanded. But it would be a simple matter to recruit it again to fight the Irish. Once Charles has crushed the Irish rebellion, he can then use the army against his enemies in England. The army felt they had been stabbed in the back in the war with the Scots, and its former soldiers view the junto as traitors. So, the junto are determined instead to raise an army of impressed men, that is, draftees, to be put under the control of their own hand-picked officers. To achieve this, they need to pass an impressment bill through Parliament. If Charles is to survive, he has to mobilise royalist support in Parliament to stop them. The King's party have a majority in the upper house, the Lords, thanks to the presence of the Church of England's bishops. While, as we know, in the House of Commons, the junto's majority is reliant on intimidation. Moderates have been kept away, frightened of the mobs. Charles has to persuade or order these moderates back to Parliament. So, on 12th December, Charles issues a proclamation summoning all members of both Houses of Parliament to return to Westminster on or before 12th January 1642. With moderates commanded to attend under this order, Pym's claims to represent the people will be exposed as a sham. Already his pretensions to power have earned him the mocking nickname King Pym. It is time to bring King Pym's reign to an end and chop off his head. The clock is now set ticking. 3 days later, on 15th December, the junto orders the printing of their grand remonstrance. The publication, with its loud claims of betrayal and threats to liberty, has an immediate effect on the council elections to the governing body of the City of London, taking place on the 21st of December. Royalist councillors lose their seats to supporters of the junto, giving the junto control not just of the council, but also potentially of the city's 8,000-strong militia. Charles needs urgently to restore his ability to keep the mobs in order in London. The following day, 22nd December, Charles replaces the pro-junto Lieutenant of the Tower with his own candidate, Thomas Lunsford. The great fortress with its cannon will allow him to overawe any mobs mobilised against him in London. But Lunsford is a hated figure who liked to boast that he was fierce enough to eat children. Factious citizens, organised by city radicals in league with the junto, now descend on Parliament with their swords by their sides. Charles tries to lower the political temperature by replacing Lunsford with a less controversial figure. but it's too late. From Christmas Eve to Boxing Day, the riots continue and worsen. On 27th December, when the Archbishop of York, John Williams, gets out of his coach at Westminster, he has to fight off thugs with his fists. Imagine that, an archbishop fighting with his fists. The junto's orchestrated violence has made it unsafe for any bishops to now attend the Lords, and so the royalist majority in the upper house is lost. Mob rule is winning. As moderate MPs have not yet answered Charles's summons to Parliament, the junto are left free to push through the impressment bill that will give them control of the army and enable them to strip Charles of the last of his powers. But the king's supporters have begun to flood into London. On 29th December, there are blows at Whitehall Palace between junto supporting citizens carrying clubs and swords and royalist gentlemen of the court who went over the rails striking at them with drawn swords. A nation divided. The next day, 30th December, Archbishop Williams urgently petitions the king to prorogue Parliament, arguing that without the bishops, the Lords was no longer properly constituted. This would ensure the business of legislation is suspended, and so Charles can't then be stripped of the last of his powers. But that same night, the junto-packed Commons has 10 of the 12 petitioner bishops arrested and imprisoned. With Charles's rule set to be dismantled long before the 12th January deadline, he makes a last-ditch effort to reach out to his enemies and find compromise. On 1st January, he offers Pym the coveted post of Chancellor of the Exchequer. King Pym turns him down. Time is now running out for Charles. Something drastic has to be done. On 3rd January, the king decides to use the parliamentary process of impeachment to charge 6 of the junto with acts of treason. They include 5 members of the Commons, Pym amongst them. Charles hopes the legal proceedings against the 6 accused will clog up parliamentary business until the 12th January date. It's important to take note here, Charles is taking the legal parliamentary route, but this is blocked. The junto-dominated House of Lords appoint a committee to decide if the charges are lawful. And when the King's Sergeant-at-Arms arrives at the Commons to arrest the 5 members, he is turned away. The junto now strike as close to the king as they dare. That night, news reaches Charles that Parliament is to deprive the Queen of most of her household clergy. Henrietta Maria believes that unless Charles intervenes personally to have the 5 MPs arrested, she will have to flee England. People are saying she's only a subject. She can therefore be executed for treason, as queens have been in England before. Don't forget, she's been accused of being behind the Irish Rebellion. It is her life or Pym's. "Pull those rogues out by the ears," she is said to have warned Charles, "or never see my face more." Others also urged Charles to act. At 10 p.m, Charles orders the cannon at the Tower to be armed. London is eerily quiet the next morning, 4th January. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Charles emerges from his quarters at Whitehall. He flags down a carriage off a man in the street and asks to be taken to Parliament. MPs may have ignored the arrest warrant for the 5 members delivered by Charles's Sergeant-of-Arms. Charles, now desperate, believes they won't ignore an order from his own mouth. As the king's carriage rumbles down the street, followed by 400 or 500 armed cavaliers, a junto supporter in the crowd runs ahead to warn the Commons. The 5 MPs flee the Commons chamber and hide in the neighbouring court of the King's Bench. Those MPs sitting in the Commons now hear the clatter as the king comes up the stairs, followed by his men. They then see the king at the door and behind a crush of soldiers. One holds a pistol in his hand, already cocked. A false move, and there will be blood on the floor of the Commons. In the silence, Charles walks centre stage to the Speaker's chair and addresses his MPs. He requests the 5 members be given up and looks around, hoping to spot where they are. "I do not see any of them," he says. "I think I should know them." There is nothing left to do but leave. The humiliation is evident as Charles walks out, the silence giving way to shouts of "Privilege! Privilege!" a reminder of the free rights of the Commons. The angry voices pursue him all the way down the stairs. As one royalist later recalled sadly, all that the junto had ever said of plots and conspiracies against Parliament, which had before been laughed at, was now thought true and real. Charles had made a fatal miscalculation. Henrietta Maria was blamed for the attempted arrests of the 5 members, and Charles, fearing for his family, informed the junto that they would leave London. On Monday, 10th January, the royal family travelled by barge to Hampton Court. There, the King of England arrives in a most disconsolate, perplexed condition. The cold at Hampton Court is bitter, and there are few beds made up. Charles, Henrietta Maria, and their young children sleep together. King Charles will not see London again for 7 years, and then only to face his trial. He would be condemned as a traitor and murderer, but with Charles's death, England faced not liberty, only a new tyranny. Charles was said to have been buried during a snowstorm. The snowflakes turned the black velvet pall white. "The colour of innocence," a witness recorded, adding, "and so the White King went to his grave." But that witness was a professional liar. There was no snow. Martyr, murderer, Charles's reign is a story of alternative facts and fake news. No side had the monopoly of virtue or villainy, and that a nation divided as much by misunderstanding and mistrust as anything else should end up in civil war is the true tragedy of the reign of Charles I.
Our thanks to Leanda de Lisle. Thank you very much for participating in the Red Funnel Isle of Wight Digital Literary Festival. If you've enjoyed this presentation, please consider making a donation. Follow the Donate Now button from the homepage of our website. You can also benefit from great discounts by ordering via Blackwell's Bookshop from our homepage. We'd like to thank the loyal sponsors who've supported the Isle of Wight Literary Festival over the past years. Without their financial contribution, it would be difficult to attract the many wonderful speakers we've hosted, while keeping ticket prices down. This year, their support has enabled us to provide the digital festival free of charge. Special thanks to Red Funnel, who've been our title sponsor for many years, and, as well as providing financial support, offer a warm welcome to speakers and visitors to the island for the festival.